doing today is we're going to have a kind of an interactive workshop style conversation around strategies for setting up external innovation programs. Dalal and Neil are going to lead that for us. For full disclosure, I should say Dalal and Neil are working with me on starting a business, as I mentioned also when Neil did the startup showcase yesterday in the forum. So just don't want anybody to feel like we're hiding that detail. Hopefully that feels like an endorsement, not a disclosure that should be alarming, but I did want to just kind of be upfront about the relationship that I have with both Dalal and Neil. I got to know both of them when they were both students at Carnegie Mellon. It's been a pleasure to kind of stay in touch with them and obviously work on this with them. Neil, as I said in the email intro, literally kind of wrote the book on this. So when I got to know Neil, he was an undergrad chemical engineering student at Carnegie Mellon who decided that in addition to getting his chemical engineering degree, he would do a startup because chemical engineering apparently wasn't hard enough for Neil. So he did a startup, which is where I got to know him. And then after that startup ended up at the Gates Foundation, he worked at a couple of our portfolio companies in business development, and then spent some time at Estee Lauder running their external innovation program. And so has seen this from both sides of the table, if you will, and then wrote a book called The Startup Goldmine on these interactions. And so Neil and I kind of come at this corporate innovation thing from kind of opposite perspectives, but have been both kind of bouncing around on this for a while. And then Dalal's done innovation in startups, innovation in big companies. I got to know her when she was a student at Tepper. Actually got to know her husband as well. Matt Crespi is on with me today. Matt and I taught a class at Carnegie Mellon, which continues to be offered today, the project course, but Matt and I had Dalal's husband in that class. So we've kind of got to know Dalal originally through Mashari and then got to know her as well. And it's been just a blast to work with them on this. They actually came to Florida and escaped without COVID. So that was good a couple of weeks ago for a 2-day strategic planning stuff around the business that we're starting. And as we were talking about that, pulled them in to work on this workshop. So I'm going to have them kind of drive it. I will spotlight their videos and have them kind of walk you through this, but I'm going to stay involved kind of as a active participant, if you will, through the next kind of hour and a half here. So we'll hand it over to Neil and Dalal.
All right, thanks, Sean. So today's session is going to be a bit different than the sessions for the last couple of days, which were more talk or lecture style. Today, I think especially with the group that we have here, I think it makes a lot of sense to just do this as a very interactive, very much a collaborative type of workshop. You know, as Sean was saying, I have experience in external innovation. I helped build Estee Lauder's program when I was full-time there, and then started a consulting business later where I work with both startups who are trying to work with larger companies as customers or as investors or even for acquisitions. And then I also work with corporate innovation groups on either setting up external innovation programs or helping them improve their external innovation program. That said, I don't know everything about this world. I don't think anybody does. And I'm really curious to hear other people's perspectives, no matter which part of the ecosystem you come from, because I mean, if anybody who's read my book in here knows that in that book, one of the major themes is kind of empathy and trying to understand the other side. And I think, you know, there's always room for new perspectives here. And so the way that I've structured this workshop is we're going to go through a few things, but in each section, and you can see those on your screen, the sort of table of contents, but for each of these sections, I think it's going to really have a lot of audience participation as well, because I want to hear your perspective. There's probably a lot of things that you've done or are doing in your program, or if you're a startup, or that you might have seen from the other side that I just haven't. So I think let's try to keep this interactive. And I think in the spirit of that, we have a fairly small group here right now. It's other than us hosts, there's 11 people. So maybe if we want to do very quick 1-sentence introductions, basically what I mean by that 1 sentence, we can all see your name, but I want to hear what perspective you're bringing to the table, whether you're a student, whether you're worked in corporate innovation, whether you've worked in a startup, any bit about your perspective. And I guess since there's 10 folks here, maybe we try to limit that to a few sentences would be great.
Neil, I'll go first. James Howard, I'm at Tepper School of Business in my final year. I'm helping a couple of startups right now that have a lot of B2B components. And I think I want to understand the perspective of being the external innovator for some of these large corporations.
Got it. That's helpful.
I can go next. I'm Sagar Bhaviskar. I'm a PhD student at CMU. I did my master's at CMU as well. Serial entrepreneurship, had a great journey there. Still working on a couple of ideas. Was working in industry as well. So in consulting capacity as well as a technologist, offering management, product management with IBM Watson Health. So healthcare, e-commerce, digital platform are the domains I work in.
Hi, I'm Richard Citrin. I'm an organizational psychologist, primarily focused on leadership development. Did a session a few days ago on employee engagement around COVID for the forum. And I think what I'm finding in my work is so many of my leaders are asking about innovation and how do we bring it to our businesses, that that's kind of my focus for this is more around innovation within existing companies.
Hey, Matt Crespi. Good to see some familiar faces. Corporate Startup Lab co-founder and a bunch of other stuff that would take too long to list. So I'll use the rest of my sentence to jump off something Neil said, where he said nobody knows everything about this world. I'd take it a step further and say that the sum total of human knowledge on this subject doesn't even come close to approaching everything there is to know on this subject at the moment. So not only is there a lot of expertise in the room, but there's also just a ton to learn. Just throw that out there as a challenge to the group.
Yep, absolutely.
Hi, this is Ross McLaughlin. I'm with Quick Trip Corporation. So for everybody out there in the Pennsylvania area, we're like a sheets or wall off for this section of the country, more the Midwest. And so I lead our kind of corporate development area, where we've been looking at adding additional lines of business, similar to probably what you've heard from Mary Beth Green over at Sheets of how to diversify. We've launched a startup internally, but what we've also done a lot of is try to think of ideas on our own. And there's a whole lot more smart people who don't work for us than who do. And so I'm looking at how do we start leveraging that.
Hey, Rishabh here. I'm a grad student from CMU's software management program. So I'm based out of Silicon Valley location. For me, I've kind of worked with Intel as an Intel software innovator. So for me, I've kind of helped them along the way with their IoT, AI, and perceptual computing products. But in this case, I've joined just to understand, how it works for other companies as well.
Hi all, my name is Rishi. I'm a master's student at the Integrated Innovation Institute here at Carnegie Mellon. I have a background in health tech and biotech for the last couple of years, and I'm currently actually a CSL fellow working with Optum here at the SWOT Center.
Hi, this is Shirley. I'm a BME grad student at CMU, and I'm as well a CSL fellow working with Optum. And I previously worked for a small company, a healthcare biomedical devices company. And the kind of perspective I would like to learn through this session is to how to support innovation in the field of healthcare, rural health, and sustainability solutions.
Hi, everyone. I'm a master's student of the Human Computer Interaction program. And before this, I worked at big tech companies as a product and UX designer. And my interest lies in leveraging emerging technologies and improve the current services or products in the digital world.
Hello. Yeah, I'm just here to see what everyone's talking about today. I'm a software developer intern at Bank of New York Mellon right now. Yeah, nice to meet everyone. Hello.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anna. I am a CMU grad, an alum of Sean's corporate entrepreneurship classes. I am currently a UX researcher at Google, but before this, I was an everything startup designer at Numo, which is PNC's financial tech incubator that we heard from day one of this forum. Happy to be here.
Awesome. It's great to meet everyone. Okay, so I guess let's jump into it. So I guess just to set some kind of basic language agreement for what we're talking about here, when I refer to external innovation, I mean it in a pretty broad sense. So some companies, and Estee Lauder was one of those companies, they started external innovation as simply a way to work with startups. And I think that's obviously part of it, but it's certainly not the whole picture. So I take a broad approach to what external innovation means. I refer to external innovation as sourcing innovation from outside of the walls of your organization. And I think Ross, or I think it was Ross who brought it up, there are a lot of smart people who don't work for your company. And that to me is like the essence of the value of external innovation is there's people working on things outside, maybe even outside your industry, to be quite honest, that are very relevant to problems that you're trying to solve. Those could be startups, but they could also come from universities. They could be individual inventors. You'd be surprised some of the people out there and what they can create. And then it can even be corporate partners. And I know sometimes that can get a little tricky, but there is definitely potential for combining your expertise with another corporate who has expertise in a different area. And it doesn't have to be, a branded partnership in the sense that, you could co-market, you could say that, hey, this is like the Intel Inside type of model, right? Where it says it becomes clear that, oh, Intel is the one providing the chips for this computer. That's one way to do it. But there are other ways where you don't even have to talk about who's providing the technology from a customer facing standpoint. So there's a lot of ways to leverage corporate partners too. Obviously, those deals can be a little slower than working with startups, which we'll get into, but I take external innovation in a broad sense. So just establishing some definitions there. So I think everybody has a pretty good sense from what I heard of the value of external innovation. Just to kind of recap a little bit, you can get primarily technology, but could be other things through external partners. That's kind of number one, faster adoption than trying to do everything yourself. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Not having a monopoly on knowledge is kind of exactly what we were just, we were talking about, that there's a lot of smart people outside of the four walls. But I think the one point we didn't touch on yet is that interacting with companies external to your organization can stimulate the internal innovation as well. And what I mean by that is just being aware of what's happening in the industry, not working in a silo, talking to innovators, whether those are from universities or from startups or from other places. It's inspiring in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of value to that. And sometimes it's hard to quantify, but I think there's value to having more people involved externally, or at least exposed to that external knowledge. It's very easy to get sucked into your silo, and it's hard to get outside of the four walls because it's often, maybe your bonus isn't tied to that, or your KPIs are not tied to those external conversations. And so as innovation leaders, I think it's important to expose as many people within the org, especially the innovation / R&D part of the org, to external ideas and what's kind of happening out there in the broader market. So we started doing a little bit of this. I would love if Ross, particularly, you and I think Richard as well had brought some other things up, and anyone else in the group, if you guys are open to sharing more about your programs and what you've done, what you've attempted, I'd love to hear that. And I think it would be really helpful for the group. I'm happy to start as well and talk about some of the programs that I've been involved in. But yeah, so I can start. And if anyone else wants to participate, that would be super interesting too, I think, for everyone to hear. I can start. I'll talk about Estee Lauder and a couple of the other programs. I mean, when I joined Estee Lauder, we didn't have any kind of formalized external innovation program, but I think every company has some form of external innovation going on. It's just ad hoc in many cases. And what I mean by that is, you might have supplier-led innovation where your suppliers are presenting, and we'll get more into this in a later slide, but suppliers are presenting the latest things that they've developed and they want to effectively sell that to you. That's a form of external innovation. It's things being invented outside your four walls. There are parts of your org that are, of course, working with startups. They may not care that it's a startup. They're just focused on the solution, but that is also obviously a form of external innovation. If your company engages in corporate venture capital or acquisitions of small companies, that's another form of external innovation. So Estee Lauder was doing a lot of this stuff. I don't want to say none of it was happening, but there wasn't any kind of core strategy. Everyone was rowing in their own direction. Let's put it that way. So that's really what our program was designed to do. It's, hey, we don't want to slow down what people are already doing, but we want to focus it a little bit and make sure we're not duplicating efforts across different brands or different parts of the company. So at Estee Lauder, that was the big issue. It was already happening, but it wasn't being done effectively. I did work with an insurance company on building an external innovation program. And the challenges there, to be honest, were very different. They were actually not doing a ton of external innovation, and they are a little bit more of a regulated market than cosmetics. And so the issue often became is, how do you actually work with startups in a regulated environment where you can't just push code and show things to your customers that haven't gone through kind of the full process. And that's a little bit different of a challenge and required a bit more cooperation with legal, was a bit slower than the Estee Lauder process, but still they were able to drive a decent amount of interesting activity through external partners. So those are kind of two experiences that, I can even go into a little bit more detail, but would love to hear from the group and see if anyone else is open to sharing.
This is Ross. I'm glad to share a little bit more on our side. I think for us, like you said, it's existing. We have some, but typically it's more on the product side. With CPGs, they have something new. We obviously work with that. Or we're doing technology scouting, but it's typically to solve immediate problems. So I think a lot of our external innovation is more incremental versus transformative. So then when I think about what we're trying to do with creating new business lines, we've had success on a few, but again, what we've really done is it was either a small pivot to our existing model, but it still opens up new growth opportunities for us. Or in another one, and everybody, it seems like half the people on here are involved in healthcare. So we've actually we've launched a new to industry urgent care chain, which for us, we were already completely self-insured, self-administered, doing own direct primary care, that type of stuff, direct contracts with hospitals. And from what we were seeing, we just felt that the urgent care business, that we had an opportunity to maybe run it in a different way. And we're liking what we're doing so far. But I would say, again, we didn't rely very heavily externally on that. And also, I would say we probably didn't test it as effectively. So yesterday, if we think about the presentation of saying you either put too much money on something really quickly or, we did that. We've got lucky on it. It was a good bet so far. But when you're sitting here going, oh, the building really matters and all of this really matters, we didn't think of how do we go test this without buying a bunch of land and building a bunch of buildings. We just went and bought a bunch of land and built a bunch of buildings with the hope that it would be okay on the end. But going forward, what I'm trying to create for us is how do we keep looking at things that are not just incremental, and then how do we really go leverage other people's ideas or make those right connections to do something different.
Yeah, and I guess that was an interesting jumping off point too, because it's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately is how do you make the cost of being wrong as little as possible so that you can essentially have more shots on goal, right? That's something I've been thinking about. Ross, do you guys do or have a formal pilot program where you work on, where kind of the cost of being wrong might be, let's say low 5 figures or mid 5 figures versus, investing millions of dollars into an initiative?
I would say on the things that we've done, this is the one that probably we didn't have as good of a pilot on. On other things, typically we have a team working on it, and I would say it takes too long. We haven't dedicated resources. So when we've done it, instead of coming to an answer and being able to kill it in 3 months, it drags on for a year because everybody's doing it it's everybody's and nobody's focused. And so we're slow. We'll have to fix that. But we've killed some ideas just through research, just through kind of if you think about the Rita McGrath, the reverse income statement modeling, things of that nature. We've done that type of stuff, and we've built some stuff there. We'll spend some stuff on studies to start with, but with this one, we went from spending some stuff on studies, hiring a little bit of consulting, going, we think it could be real, to okay, let's go pay to design a building, build it, and all that. So no, on this one, it was from some people's time, and we think it could be real, to all right, we're in for 5 or 10 million. Let's see how it works. I don't want to do that continually.
Right. Well, and then you can't take too many bets if that's your bet size, right? Then you have to be right, which is a tough place to be. Yeah, and I guess that the other thing related to that I've been thinking about, which might be a good thought starter for anyone who's on the startup side of the equation. Ross, I don't think you guys are unique. A lot of companies struggle with what you're struggling with on that, because you're not used to, in a corporate environment, being wrong more than you're right. But I think Sean can tell you, more about this than even I can, because I don't come from venture capital. But in venture capital, it's very common to be I mean, it's expected to be wrong most of the time, but the times you are correct, it's a big outcome. And so I'm not saying corporate innovation or external innovation will have the hit rate or maybe the lack of hit rate that venture capital has, but to expect that every project and to make bets as if every project will be successful is very, very risky. And I think setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, Neil. I would also say, like, the other half of that is important though too, right? That like the bets pay off enough that it, like, what's terrible is have the VC hit rate for very adjacent innovation, right? And that feels actually like a common failure point on these programs as well. Yeah, I think what you want to do is you want to make sure your impact can map to the hit rates you're talking about here as well.
Yep. Anyone else want to chime in on this section?
I guess we could plug that CSL is part of many corporate and external innovation programs.
That is
certainly
true.
Yep. You can see the slide on your screen. We have 4 different buckets, but I think there are others, and I'm curious if anyone has experience with others, but these are, from what I've, in my work, these are the 4 that I've kind of turned to the most. But startup/tech scouting, I lump those together because startups are very often working on new technologies, but tech scouting doesn't always have to be startups. So I just want to call out that caveat there. Open innovation, where you're kind of trying to build an inbound funnel where you might have an innovation portal and you're listing your needs, whether technology needs, product needs, or something else, and inviting companies or individuals to apply with solutions. There also are accelerators, incubators, university and research partnerships where you partner with a university to develop technology or at least sponsor research that's related to something you're looking for. And then supplier-led innovation, which we talked about a second ago, where your suppliers will be presenting ideas or new tech that they've developed to you in the hopes that you would adopt that. So those are kind of 4 of the buckets. I'm curious if people have seen any others that maybe aren't listed here. I think there's one that I just thought of that's not on my own slide, but Sean's comment about the venture capital got me thinking a little bit. I think investors are actually an interesting source of external innovation as well. And you might be able to count that under startup and tech scouting, but kind of cultivating a network of investors who are close to the ground is an interesting source of information as well. So now we're going to talk about challenges a bit. And I don't mean challenges in the sense of open innovation challenges. I'm going to say struggles with external innovation. So some of the problems that come about. I can go first. And then, this is something, even if you're on the startup side of the equation or you've never worked in corporate innovation directly, you probably would have an opinion on. Basically, what are struggles with bringing an external technology into a large company? I'm actually extra curious to hear about from the startup side of this. So if you've been on the other side of the table, I think there's a lot of value to you sharing your opinion so that folks in this room who are on the corporate side can better understand how they can better work with you. That's a big focus of my book, as well as just kind of having both sides speak the same language. So I think that's the number one challenge is language and then time reference. So for a startup, a month is a long time. If I tell you let's say we get in contact with each other today, you're a corporate innovator, I'm a startup founder, and you agree that, hey, there's some potential here. Let me get you on my calendar. And the next spot on your calendar is a month from now. Well, that's a long time in startup world. Things might be very, very different in a month. Not always, but it's very possible. Whereas that's not always true in a corporate environment. Maybe just all the people that need to be on the call can't make it for a month to find that one slot on the calendar that everyone's free. So that's one challenge that I've run into every single time I've done one of these, whether from the corporate side or from the startup side. There's things you can do to solve that, but it is also just part of the DNA of both types of organizations that are just, they don't have the same time references. That's a big one. I think incentives are another one. You often have with startups for a founder, some of them are paying themselves, especially as they raise money and move faster, or move further along the life cycle. But the vast majority of their compensation from their company is going to come from an exit or from essentially the upside of that company. So they're hyper focused on growing their company and kind of And when I mean growing their company, that might mean from a customer perspective, or it might be showing their investors a positive proof point so they can raise their next round, or it might be some other metric that they're optimizing for, but it's primarily tied to the enterprise value of their company. On the corporate side, I can say from personal experience, I didn't really care about Estee Lauder's, market cap. I think in general, I cared. Like, I'd actually prefer the company to be better off than not, but it wasn't tied too much to my. I mean, it was a little bit through some of the option grants and stuff that they gave, but it's like the percentage of my comp that was tied to the enterprise value versus my salary versus my bonus are nowhere close to the startup founders. Where on a startup founder, a successful exit for that founder means 99% of their comp probably came from the acquisition of the company, if not more than 99%. And the salary became a rounding error. And you wouldn't have that in a corporate environment. So you just have a little bit of different salary structures as well, or payment structures. And then there's also the incentives around, this may not be incentives, might not be the right word. It might be focus is the right word. So if I'm a startup founder talking to a corporate innovator, that deal, if we can close that, for me as a startup founder, is probably the biggest deal I'm going to close all year, or at least it's the biggest deal I'm working on at the moment. So it's getting it's my number one priority. On the corporate side, again, speaking from personal experience, our portfolio was like 200 active deals at various stages of completion at any given time. Some of these are just intros, some are further down the funnel, but our pipeline was about 200 companies. And so any individual deal, sure, some were more important than others because they had maybe management's attention or they were solving big needs within the organization. So those might be higher priority. But when you have a portfolio of 200, it's hard to have that same level of focus that a founder might have when they're really only working on one massive deal at a time. So those are kind of three challenges that stand out to me from where I sat, but curious to hear from other folks in the room.
I'll jump in with a couple too. So I would say, and Neil, I think you do a good job in your book walking through this, like legal risk and compliance means very different things to a startup and to a corporate. And so just sort of the process of procuring is very, very different. Maybe adjacently related to your salary concept, but more just kind of revenue. The difference between a free pilot and a paid pilot for a startup is super material. How much the paid pilot is probably less material to some. I mean, a $1 pilot is not actually helpful either. But the point is, like, the difference between a $10,000 and a $20,000 pilot is probably a lot less important than just that it's 10,000 instead of free. And I think corporates often underappreciate how valuable some small amount of money could be to just incenting a startup to making this all kind of work out for everybody.
It's funny that you talked about, Sean, about risk and compliance in larger corporations, because that was, that's one of my previous experiences. And when we had these, kind of startup deals coming to the table, even the importance that we give to them sometimes is not as much as the bigger deals, because it's not that material, and we would focus on, more our efforts and times on the bigger deals. And I think that's one of the bigger challenges that startups would face, kind of bringing in deals, to the corporate floor.
Yeah, and I think to that point, like if you can create a streamlined process for people, that just makes both sides happy, right? Like their G4A program and other programs like that, where there's kind of this easy front door to interact through it.
I think some of the barriers to making these easy doors happen is a combination of what Neil and Sean were saying about, you've got incentive structures, and then you've got these legal and compliance issues. And Neil, you were talking about like incentive structures on the upside, but in a large organization, there are lots of people that face incentive structures on the downside too. And they create sort of what I sort of mentally call like a department of no, where anything new carries some risk. And, the downside risk to you making the wrong call, like I said no to something I shouldn't have, is like, oh, well, you should have said yes to that. But the downside risk to saying yes to something you should have said no to is you lose your job. So that the default position in many of these departments, especially in companies in regulated markets, especially in legal departments, but not exclusively there, is to err to the side of no. Whereas in a startup and in an innovation ecosystem, you want people erring to the side of yes. Let's find a way to say yes. Now let's find a way to say no. I'll say when we were getting the corporate startup lab project course set up, Sean and I got to the point where we had to sort of divide and conquer at one point. And not realizing what we were doing, we said, all right, it was decided that, yeah, Sean, you talk to these lawyers, Matt, you talk to these students, because we can't do everything together anymore. And that wound up being the best deal I think I've ever made in my entire life, not intentionally, just because I got to talk to, I spent my week with a bunch of people who were energized and wanted to say yes and do stuff and make stuff happen. And Sean went and talked to 4 different teams of lawyers. The difference was immediately clear right there on what kind of energy leads to innovation.
Yeah, I think the legal and compliance one is a really good call out. I have experience on that on the startup side of the table, where I had a company in the alcohol industry, and below it's a very regulated market. We were doing a new business model. Anyone who knows that market knows the distribution laws are very convoluted in the United States for alcohol. There's local rules, state rules, and federal rules. Below a certain size, nobody really cares. Essentially, if you're not making money, no regulator is really paying attention to you. So our new model worked really well for a period of time. And then we ended up having an acquisition opportunity where a company who's a very large company in that industry approached us, and it just fell apart in legal review because there's we don't know if this model is legal or not. And we don't want to own a model that we don't know if it's legal because it could threaten our license, which means it could threaten the rest of their business, which doesn't make sense for them to do for this tiny startup, which I am completely on the same page with them on, and I would have made that exact same decision. So Matt, and I think Sean, maybe you called it out as well, this legal and compliance risk equation that you make on the corporate side, it's very different than on the startup side. So that's a very important call out.
From the startup perspective, I had 2 situations this year. The first kind of echoes Sean's point on paid pilots, dealing with corporates that they don't want to pay a penny to a startup until the technology has reached a certain technical readiness level, but they'll spend orders of magnitude more than you can imagine doing internal development that doesn't go anywhere fast enough. I think it's important for corporates to understand that the amount of money the startup needs to get to that level you need to be at is almost negligible in some of the budgets. And I think that corporates have they have a low risk tolerance for funding those early stages where a little bit of money does a lot of good. And then the second scenario is a startup founder who developed a technology as a side gig while working for a large possible strategic partner. I mean, there's no problem with the IP there, but the strategic partner has no ability or experience working with startups or doing external innovation. So even though the technology fits really well into their strategy, they simply don't have anyone in place to handle that sort of deal. So they try and run everything through their usual corporate and legal process. And to no surprise, it's not going very quickly.
That's a great call out, James. I think the process part of this is another interesting thing. That was another piece of the Estee Lauder work, was we had the same process for bringing on a Fortune 500 company as a vendor as we had for bringing on a 3-person startup, and same insurance requirements, same everything. And it made doing business really difficult to have a startup go through that process. I will say companies have increasingly done a better job of creating separate tracks for for startups versus traditional vendors, I should say. But there's a long way to go still. And I think not every company has done it. I mean, there's a handful of companies that have publicly talked about it and I think are actively trying to make that better. I mean, P&G is one that I've seen firsthand try to do a good job with that. But yeah, there's still a long way to go to separate that out in a way that makes the corporate feel protected, right? That they're not going to end up in a Theranos type situation where they're publicly affiliated with a fraud or failed company, but at the same time optimizing for speed and actually getting to that first step of a pilot relatively quickly. So you have a little more data to go on than just, a presentation or verbal things. You want to get to real world data so that you can make a knowledgeable decision.
I'll just add to James' point and then I can probably move on. But on this concept of companies not wanting to pay, like, I think it really is just this lack of understanding of the relative importance of that to the two groups. And sometimes it gets extreme. We've got a number of CSL fellows on who are working with Optum right now. So just to be clear, the company I'm about to talk about is not Optum. It's another healthcare company, but there's a healthcare company in Pittsburgh. So that narrows it down to two. I won't say which one, who regularly tells me that they want startups to pay them for help getting access to the healthcare market. And like, it's just this mind-blowing conversation to me, because I'm kind of like, you have all this money. They have, like, in what world does that seem like a good, exchange between the two? There's either you haven't come up with anything creative enough that actually is valuable for you to work on, in which case don't waste the startup's time if they can pay you a little bit of money, because it's going to be a rounding error to the company still. Or
Right.
It's just an incredibly arrogant position in my mind to be like, oh, yeah, this 4-person startup that's living on ramen noodles, I think that they should cut me a check for 50 grand. Like, it's a remarkable extreme version of, I think, what James was talking about. And certainly large healthcare companies can be incredibly helpful to startups. That's why Optum started the Optum Startup Studio. That's why there's been plenty of other interesting things in the space. But that help should be accretive to both groups, not looking to extract it from the 4-person startup.
Sean, that's a really good call out too, is I think you got to think about as if you're on the corporate side of the table, what you have that's valuable to startups. And so cash is one of those things. But if you think about it, a startup is often going to use that cash to go buy things you probably already have. Right. So I think J&J is one example of this, where they call it just J&J Labs, Sean, or is there another name for it? I think it's
J Labs.
J Labs. I knew it. Yeah, it was something, not J&J Labs. So they have the J Labs program where companies can apply to join. It's kind of like an incubator, but they have a lot of equipment there. They have lab space there, because honestly, if they invested $100K into your company, you're going to go work at a lab. You're going to have to use a good chunk of that cash to buy equipment and go work in a lab. And so it's looking at, hey, what do we bring to the table that a startup would need in our space? And for many companies, that might be lab space, equipment. For people in healthcare, it might be regulatory expertise. It might be legal help. It might be distribution. But there are a lot of assets that a large company has that go beyond cash. And I think thinking about how you can make the case internally, if you're trying to pitch this to other stakeholders within your large company, it's much easier. I think, at least, it's much easier to say, hey, we're going to incubate these startups. We're not paying them, but we need to spend a little bit of time with them with legal or with our retail team. And that's a much easier pitch, because I know as soon as cash becomes part of the equation, even if James, as you said, they spend way more money on internal development on things that very often don't go anywhere, that budget is already set. And so you're asking for new money, and that's a much tougher sell than saying, hey, we already have, this lab space that we're not using. Maybe we can invite startups to work out of there, 2 days a week or something. I'm just making this up off the top of my head. But as a thought exercise, it's really good to think about assets you have that somebody new in that space would need to go get to participate, and then seeing how you can build that into your external innovation program.
J&J is a good example, because they do that not just with startups, but with universities too. And they're very aware of what a little bit amount of money for them can mean to, a fledgling short center kind of endeavor, or, student startups, which have even less money, if that's imaginable, than, the student startup worth of, negative 50 grand as opposed to zero. But Johnson & Johnson will just write a check to university and say, hey, we'd like to buy you a super tech enabled conference room that you can use to do whatever you want with, but also have meetings with us remotely, and have our those sort of super digital conference rooms where it feels like you're all together. We're just going to put one in your building, if that's okay with you, and use it to keep in touch with your startups and your innovators.
Yeah, so. And I bet for the university to buy that on a one-off basis costs more than when J&J is buying this.
Yeah, it's not in a university's budget. You know, when you're
Right.
starting one of these things, it's like, yeah, we need meeting space. We're not going to invest in all this tech, and you know, we don't need the fanciest thing. But J&J says, well, we want a window into what you're doing. We want to help. We want to know what's going on. They're keeping their eye out for opportunities, and sometimes they do that very literally by like, we're just going to buy some cameras and put them in your building in a very non-creepy, helpful way.
But yeah, I think the point is thinking outside of the box a little bit beyond just cash. Because frankly, I mean, on the startup side of the equation, right, there's a lot of places you can get cash from. So cash is not really the reason to go work with a corporate partner. I mean, obviously as a customer, you'd want them as a customer, but if we're talking about cash to grow the company or a corporate venture capital type scenario, I mean, there are some times where you would take the cash from a CVC, but usually you're doing that with the hope that there's more than just the cash that comes along with it. So some strategic benefit or something else.